So, friends, it's said that one of the best predictors early in life that later in life you will become a Unitarian Universalist is this. It's that one day in Sunday school, the Sunday school teacher took you aside and told you that you were asking too many questions. That's how you knew you were going to grow up to be a Unitarian Universalist, okay? And that's why once a year, I always like to have a service where we welcome our questions into the room, where we welcome our doubts and our struggles, because ours is a faith that does welcome question and doubt and struggle. And so what I've done is asked ahead of time for folks in the church to submit questions, okay? And those will come in, and I will answer as many of those today during the sermon time as I can. Now, why do we do this? I just want to say a couple of things. I find this really helpful because hearing your questions makes me a better pastor to all of you, right? It's helpful for me to know the struggles that are in your hearts and minds. And so I really benefit from this and learn from your questions and struggles. But I think there's a benefit to all of us, too, because I think it's important for us as a spiritual community to know what we are struggling with together, right? And to know that our struggles, that we don't carry them alone, that others share some of the same struggles that we do. And it helps us be more compassionate to one another, okay? So just a couple of things to remember before I answer the questions. I've taken a look at the questions, and I've slept on them, but I have not scripted an answer, and so I'm going to be answering these questions extemporaneously this morning. 2, your questions are my questions too. Your struggles are my struggles. I don't pretend to have all the answers. So I'm calling these responses rather than answers, right? But the point is we're all learning together today. What else did I want to say? Oh, though each question was submitted by an individual, my response today here in this space is to the congregation as a whole. Some of you may want to follow up with your question with me personally because, if we were in my office and we were talking about this, I'd have a chance to unpack that question a little bit and hear more from you. Can't do that here today, so I'm going to respond to the congregation as a whole. And finally, we received many more questions. I was really excited. Then we'll have time to answer today. So we're going to get as many of them as we can. And if I didn't get to your question, again, give me a call. Let's set up a time and we can talk about it. Okay? So without further ado, then, I'm going to invite Kathy to kind of embody our questions and to share them, and then I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Well, it's an honor to read the questions, and that's all I'm doing. I'm embodying, as he said. Excuse me. The first one is probably not this person alone. I know others share this. I do. They write, "Nothing in my heart or experience leads me to believe that there is an afterlife, at least not one where I continue to be me, conscious, aware, a continuation of myself. I expect that death will be like deep sleep, only permanent. Without belief in an afterlife, I feel a lot of fear, especially as I get older and closer to the end. Even more, I feel grief at the massive loss I am facing. I also feel deep gratitude for the many good fortunes I've had in this life, and I accept that everything is impermanent and part of the ongoing cycle of nature, but the fear and grief remain. Is there a way I can find comfort and peace about death without a belief in an afterlife?"
Thanks for that question. We're jumping in the deep end here. Having spent a lot of time accompanying people through the process of dying, there are many things that I know that can allow us to approach death with more peace and comfort rather than less. I want to share a couple of those before responding to this question particularly. As we approach the end of life, it's really important to settle any unfinished business we have, especially any relationships that are not in a good place. Folks really suffer at the end of life when there's unfinished business like that. Two, practice forgiveness. Sometimes we come to the end of life, and we have some regrets. We maybe need to forgive some people that we love. Maybe we need to forgive ourselves. Forgiveness is a really important spiritual practice as we approach the end of life. And three, I want to invite us, and this is getting now to the specific question, to as much as possible, think what it means to dwell in gratitude for love. This question points to the grief that we experience, that this person is experiencing as they approach the end of life. Grief is always the response to the loss of something that we love. So grief and love, grief always points us back to love, right? And, we can hold that grief, and that grief is real, but can we also, I wonder, just dwell in the gratitude for the love and allow ourselves to kind of rest in that love as we approach the end of life? The question says that, person says that I imagine death as a deep sleep, which sounds like a very peaceful thing to me. And imagine if we were to drift off into that slumber, embraced by this sense of love. I think I just want to say one other thing, which is, if we don't, for those of us who don't believe in an afterlife, I think it can be helpful as we approach death to try to experience ourselves as larger than we think we are, right? Larger than our bodies, connected to the earth, connected to one another, and that our influence on the world will last beyond us. I know that the people I have loved in life who have died are still with me. Their love is still with me. They are still with me in a very real and tangible way. That gives me hope that similarly, when I die, I will live on in people's hearts. And that's what I would say in this case.
Thanks, Rob. All right, a little change of pace with this question. As a newcomer to First Parish, I'm thinking a lot about how I enter into community. What roles do I take? How do I feel a part of things? This is not my workplace, although it is for some. This is not my community of activists, although it is for some. How do others discover their role and relationship with First Parish? How do I open myself to a new kind of relationship with the community?
This is a great question. I think this is a question that a lot of us are struggling with. This isn't just for newcomers to First Parish. This is for all of us. I think coming out of the pandemic, we are all asking some version of this question. How do I either enter into community or re-enter community in the wake of the isolation of the pandemic. A pandemic that took a great toll on us and our sense of connection. You know, I just read in The Atlantic recently that more than half of Americans say that there is not one person in their lives who knows them well, right? That's a striking figure to me. We're lonely and we need one another. We need community, and we're trying to figure out how to do it again because we kind of got out of the habit during the pandemic. So this is a really important thing. And I invite us all to just think about the kinds of communities that we may or may not have re-engaged with or be engaging with right now at this time in our lives and in this time in relationship to the pandemic. But to answer this question specifically, how to get involved in First Parish, here's what I suggest folks do. First, come to church and stay after, right? So, because that's where this is where we gather as a community. This is where we get to know one another in this space, in the parlor afterwards. The best place to get to know one another is to start coming regularly to the church and to build community that way. It's not so big a church that, you know, after a few Sundays you start to get known people, you know, you start to know folks and folks start to know you, and that can feel good. Second, we have small groups in the church called Soul Matters groups. These are groups of 8 to 10 people who meet monthly to explore a spiritual theme together and to kind of just check in with each other and support one another. That's a really important piece of the community at First Parish, both the spiritual community, but also just the community of care in the church. And so I would say second, join a Soul Matters group, okay? We'll be starting those up again here in the fall. And then third, I would say, and this is for all of us, find a way to just kind of jump in and serve the church in a way that feeds you spiritually, that feeds your soul. So maybe you like to sing, and singing is a form of prayer for you, and you just want to join the choir. So let's come join the choir. Or maybe you miss having kids in your life and you want to teach Sunday school. Please come and help out with our children. Find or you know, help greet folks out in the narthex on Sunday mornings, and that's a great way to meet people. So find one simple way to serve the church in a way that feeds your spirit. That's how I would invite folks to kind of get involved at First Parish.
Thanks, Rob. Great suggestions. This person writes, I love an institution where people worship the progress narrative and serve the U.S. military-industrial complex. I love a religion that denies me my indigenous identity. I love sacred places that many, if not most people, think of in mainstream culture, see as commodities. I love people who, in quotes, never had to think about that, where that is what they're referring to is queerness, women's bodily autonomy, systemic racism, structural inequality, indigenous sovereignty, cultural appropriation, and the dark side of capitalism. Committed as I am to acting for change by influencing those around me, I feel my ability to love is wearing thin. I'm struggling to refill my cup. So, comments, thoughts, Rob?
I feel the poignancy of that question, and especially given the mass shooting last night in Jacksonville that targeted people of color, hearing this person who identifies as indigenous asking for, I think, what I hear it as a call to a greater practice of solidarity with one another. It reminds me that we are all living through really difficult times right now. These are hard times for all of us, but they can be particularly difficult times for some of us, right? For those of us who might have historically marginalized identities, for folks of color, for indigenous folks, for trans folks, right? Some of us are more vulnerable than others right now. And this question kind of inspires me and calls me to a greater practice of love, a greater practice of solidarity, of allyship, right? As the person who, I forget how it's phrased, who sometimes doesn't have to think about that, right? And those things that those of us who carry some privilege around in the world don't always have to think about, and that's all of us in some ways, right? We need to start thinking about it, and we need to start educating ourselves and acting on it, and stepping up to the solidarity and love that's required of this moment. That's the challenge that my heart feels from that question. But I also feel this kind of plaintive, I'm struggling to refill my cup. And I just want to honor that. I think I heard that a lot. And I think it would do us all good to take a moment to think about what is it that refills our cup. What are the things that nurture your soul, that replenish your spirit, that replenish the love inside of you? What are they? And what's keeping you from engaging that replenishment, right? Is it you're working too much? Is it whatever it is, what is it that's keeping you from those practices? And because we need to, and then share that with a friend. Share that with a friend and ask them to help hold you accountable and have a conversation with you about how maybe you can get back to those practices that replenish your cup, okay? I think we all need to be thinking about that.
Okay. Sometimes it feels like the world is falling apart. How do we have hope?
I'm just going to sometimes it feels like the world is falling apart. How do we have hope?
How do we have hope?
We got a lot of different versions of this question. How do we have hope? We don't have hope. Hope is not something we have. It's not a feeling. Hope is something that we create. Hope is an intentional spiritual practice. Hope is a discipline. Hope is a path that we have to work to create together day in and day out, is what I want to say about hope. What is the path of hope look like for us in these kind of crazy and difficult times? I think hope looks like walking this path and not walking it alone, right? I think a lot of folks who are struggling with hope are also folks who are feeling lonely, and that the more we're in community, the more we can feel hopeful, and sometimes have our hopes brought up by our friends and loved ones. I think that as we walk down a path of hope, we need to stay in touch with our agency. We need to find a way to take action, even in the smallest ways possible. We need to stay in touch with our agency. Otherwise, we become more and more despairing, okay? So staying in touch with our agency, staying in touch with community. And I think coming back to that question of how to replenish my cup, staying in touch with the spiritual practices that feed us and nurture us on this journey. Hope is something that we're going to build together. This is why we come to church, to create and discover hope together. This is why we need each other right now.
Thanks, Rob. This question starts, I've been told that you use accept and welcome all people. Does this include those who believe that Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior? And another person writes, are humanists, agnostics, and atheists welcome here?
Yeah. Everyone wonders, am I welcome here? The answer to both those questions is yes and yes. But let me say just a little bit more about that. Unitarian Universalism is different than a lot of other faiths. The premise of our faith as Unitarians is that as each of us is walking this path of kind of what it means to be human in the world, how do we become our best selves? How do we live life most fully? It's a journey that each of us takes on our own, but then along the way we realize actually we can't come into the fullness of who we are as human beings unless we walk together with other people in community, right? And so we found our way to a church where we're walking with other people. But we came to this funny church where the people who are walking along this journey have found inspiration in their life path from different places, right? Some of us, Cushing studies with a Zen priest. Linda brings the tradition of the black church with her when she leads music on Sunday mornings. Vivian brings her Jewish faith, right? We all have kind of signposts along the way, and they're not the same as the other people in this room. And the premise of our faith is that we all have something to gain from that, that we actually are enriched by the diversity that we bring into this room, that I'm enriched by and can learn something from someone else's spiritual path. Cassandra talked about reclaiming the rosary from her Catholic upbringing, right? We can learn from one another because of our differences. But sometimes we're always like, oh gosh, am I welcome here? Because Rob used the word God, or because the music was from the gospel tradition. We always are asking these questions, am I welcome? Jim Forbes was the minister for many years of Riverside Church in Manhattan, which is a very famous, large, multicultural, multiracial church. And he said to folks at church, people kept complaining, Jim, your sermons aren't speaking to me, the music doesn't speak to me, it's a racially diverse congregation. He said, look, if you come to this church and you're getting fed by like 75% of this sermon and this service, like you're doing pretty well here, because it just means that the other 25% was meant for someone else, right? And fed someone else. And so this is what it's like to be in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. It's not for everyone, but I find it enriching and exciting. And so, yes, everyone's welcome. And sadly, I'm also looking at the clock. We have a clock here that the preacher can see. Mm-hmm. And we've hit our hour mark. And so I think that'll be our last question for today.
But maybe you can answer some of these as the year goes on,
exactly.
Some of the other questions.
Yeah, so these questions will inform my preaching as the year goes on. So again, thank you all for submitting the questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you. And let the conversation continue.